Welcome, everybody, to NetApp On Air. Another wonderful episode, another Wednesday. Sorry we're starting a little bit later today, but it's going to be worth it. I promise you that. Guys, my name is Nick Howell. Thank you so much for joining us. We love having you here. Shout out to everybody in Discord. I see you guys over there. Jeff, Steven, what's up, guys? The work. Everybody's here. Got a big crowd today for a very exciting presenter and a very exciting topic that I am kind of selfishly interested in. So, and I'll explain all of that. First and foremost, if you're not in our Discord community, if you're watching this on YouTube or Twitch, make sure you come and join us at netappdiscord.com. You can find a button there to join us, plus some information. Follow me on Twitter at DataCenterDude or on TikTok, same handle, making a bunch of content over there. And I also have my own personal YouTube channel over at youtube.com/DataCenterDude. Just search for me. You can find me there. That's fine. Yeah, make sure you follow NetApp everywhere. Follow me everywhere. And you're going to want to follow my guest everywhere. And hint, hint, he hangs out in Discord. So all of the information that you are going to be receiving today, he will be available to answer questions in an ongoing basis. So that's the beauty of the Discord. It is a sort of central community for all things NetApp, where we have product managers, engineers, subject matter experts, field experts, all kinds of stuff for you to come in, hang out with some peers, and get your questions answered. So that is what is amazing about Discord, and I'm happy to have everybody here on the show today. Woo, got a big audience. He better get ready, because I got an interesting story to share with him. He is no stranger to working with me, and in the past, he has been kind of ride or die with me for a few years now, as I've been doing my own little YouTube journey. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him on. Welcome to the stream, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Scott Bell. Scott, how you doing, man? Welcome to the show.
I'm doing great, Nick. Thanks for having me.
So I wanted to share the story of back in 2019, I had a crazy idea that I wanted to start creating content. And one of the very first people that I approached was, I believe, you and Chris Luth. And I said I had this idea that I wanted to do a kind of a Linus Tech Tips style video, but for our enterprise hardware. And we could do that stuff ourselves. And you were like, we've got this new platform coming out. It's called the A250. And we ended up making that video, and it has gone on to become one of my most watched and loved videos on my YouTube channel. So thank you very much for, I mean, you were kind of what kicked it off. At least the A250 was. And I couldn't have done that without your help. I appreciate it.
Glad to be a part of it.
Yeah. So you helped us out at Insight. In case you guys missed it, we did some live presentations and gatherings during Insight back in beginning of November, and Scott was one of our presenters. Presented multiple sessions throughout Insight. One of which we're going to kind of reprise today, because selfishly, there is a FAS 500 sitting back there, FAS 500F sitting back there in that rack, that cabinet, and in a very self-deprecating way, I still don't know that I fully have my head around today's topic. But part of the videos that I'm going to be making over the course of the next couple of months are getting that thing up and running and configured and provisioned. And I need some help with that, Scott. So I wanted to bring you on today to go over something called ADP, or Advanced Drive Provisioning. Partitioning. See, I don't even know.
That's okay.
Take us down the rabbit hole, set it up for us, because I come from the 7-mode 14+2 rule days. I certainly was a part of clustered ONTAP when it was first getting fired up 10 years ago. But that was more in line with what VMware best practices were around and stuff. So
it most certainly was. Yeah.
Standing up an array and setting up ONTAP in these down in the beginnings, in the weeds like this, is something I'm having to kind of reteach myself here 10 years later. So I look forward to your guidance, and I'll throw this up here on the screen and just kind of hand you the mic and take it away, sir.
Certainly. Well, a word of comfort for you, Nick, specifically, you are not alone. This is one of my most frequently asked subjects on a daily basis, and I'm happy to provide as much clarity as I possibly can. So without further ado, again, thanks for having me today, Nick. For those of you who don't know me, as you can see on the board, my name is Scott Bell. I'm a technical product engineer for AFF and FAS systems. I first joined NetApp in 2008, spent over 13 years in various company business units that I won't bore you with. But after I transitioned from the support center for about 7 years, did sales, tech marketing, but in last September of 2021, I was poached by a competitor, but I returned to rejoin the product operations team. So enough boring details about me.
Welcome to the Boomerang Club, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. Good to be a member. So legal says I got to do this. I'm sorry. Standard NDA. Feel free to take a screenshot if you really want to. But now that that's out of the way, I want to move on.
Yeah.
So as I mentioned today, this is one of my most frequently discussed subjects, if not daily, sometimes hourly, depending upon the severity. Hopefully, by the end of this session, you'll have a better understanding of Advanced Drive Partitioning, or ADP, not the payroll software. We'll spend most of our time together on that alone, discussing assignments, layouts between nodes in an HA pair, how to expand your aggregate, and some best practices for resiliency and performance. And then we'll wrap up with Q&A. So just as you build a house, you want to start at the bottom, work at the top, build a strong foundation. So let's start with the foundational logic of drive partitioning. So what is this ADP anyway? Well, all it is really is a storage efficiency technology. It enables capacity sharing of physical drives. You break them into pieces. Each hard drive or SSD is shared between controllers in an HA pair. It also enables your ONTAP system to provide more usable capacity than compared to whole drives. Here's an example of what a data space used to look like. This is a 12 hard drive system. Pick your favorite capacity, but in this case, I'm going to use 4 terabyte drives for easy math. So in this configuration, we would have 3 drives dedicated to each root aggregate. Then we got to have a couple spares per node, otherwise ONTAP gets cranky. And then we're finally ready to create a data partition out of 4 drives, but 2 of those are parity. So yes, Mr. Customer, I understand that you paid for 12 drives, but you only really get to use 2. Yeah, that didn't go over very well. So without ADP, out of 48 terabytes of raw storage, I told you I like easy math, we would have about 6.5 tebibytes of usable space. Not very functional, but with ADP, we jump up to almost 29 tebibytes. That is almost 4.5 times of what a configuration without would provide.
And that is all while maintaining the same levels of RAID DP parity that we've known and loved for decades.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it's also more efficient for if you still subscribe to using flash pool cache. The need for that has largely disappeared since we started providing onboard flash cache to cache your random reads. But if you still cache streaming reads or writes or multiple overwrites, flash pool is still great for that. So by default, there are 2 modes of ADP. There's root data or RD2 partitioning and root data RD partitioning. So let's start with RD2 because that is the most common that I interact with. By default, all AFF systems use it, including the previous generation FAS 8000 series. And with root RD2 partitioning, root aggregates are provisioned across a maximum of 48 SSDs during system initialization. Okay, that's the maximum that the system will initialize. We're going to go into more details in just a little bit. And whenever you expand a RAID group made of partitions with new whole drives, okay, you got new chunks going into your RAID groups, they're going to automatically be partitioned to match the existing scheme. And if you don't have an AFF, but you do have a FAS, and you happen to have all SSDs, you're still going to use RD2 partitioning because they are SSDs and you're running at least ONTAP 9.1. Now, let's go back a step to the left and choose RD partitioning. What is RD partitioning? Well, it is the default method of provisioning for entry FAS systems with embedded drives. Just like the one you saw on the slide before, this is exactly what it would use. There's an option to do this on mid and high range systems in ONTAP 9.2, and we'll go over those details in just a little bit in case you're curious. And also for historical reference, by the way, RD2 or RD partitioning more specifically was the default mechanism for drives on AFF systems with ONTAP 8.3 only. Okay. But with RD partitioning, root aggregates are provisioned across a maximum of 24 HDDs. Okay. That's it. Just 24. You can go beyond that, and we'll go over that in a little while. And just as you did with RD2, stick a whole drive into a partitioned RAID group. That drive is going to become partitioned. Be careful of mixing and matching sizes. I'll go over that momentarily. But in order to better understand ADP, you got to know how the partitions are distributed across the HA pair. Systems using RD partitioning will perform root and data assignments during system initialization. With RD partitioning itself, it's simple. The node that owns the physical drive is the owner of both root and data partitions. Picture's worth 1,000 words. Here's what that looks like. As you can see, node A root, we got the P2 partitions, which are the roots at the top, and the corresponding data partitions, and the coloring indicates they're going to stick with the same node. Okay. Now, RD2 partitioning, however, does things a little bit differently. Whichever node of the HA pair owns the physical drive is the owner of the root partition. This is important. Only root partitions are assigned during system initialization. Your data partitions are assigned after, but there's some logic behind it. And that logic is the P1 partition is assigned to the node with the lower value system ID. Okay. The P2 goes to the one with the higher value. Confused about that yet? Like I said, picture's worth 1,000 words. Here it is. As we can see here, node A has a system ID ending in 10, and node B has one ending in 12. I know it's confusing. That's how it keeps it from stepping on its toes. But there are some considerations and limitations that I do want to cover with you. The size of the root partition itself is determined by the number of drives present prior to system initialization. Okay, let me repeat that. The size of the root partitions are determined by the number of drives present during system initialization. What that means is the higher quantities of drives that are present prior to initialization will yield smaller root partitions and allow for more data space. Remember, ADP is a storage efficiency technology after all.
So is there a way to hack that, Scott, where you don't hook up all your shelves and you just maybe use your internal drives if you've got them, or maybe only hook up half of a shelf in order to maximize that smaller root aggregate size, or would you be doing yourself a disservice?
Well, as I mentioned, if you have all SSDs, like say on your AFF system, like your FAS 500F, if you have 48 drives, you're better off connecting all 48 drives at once, so that way the root gets spread across all 48. You're welcome to do internal drives only. Some customers do, where they say, okay, I don't want anything, I don't want any partitioning on the external shelves. That's totally fine too. Just disconnect everything, leave the internal drives present, and initialize with 24. You will have larger root partitions, which will decrease your usable data partition sizes.
On the embedded disks.
On the
but
internal
I would still get to do
drive.
whole disks on any shelves that I connect.
Absolutely. As soon as initialization is done, plug in as many as you want, or your system can support for that matter, and you're off to the races.
It's starting to click. It's starting to come together.
All right. Very good. Very good. So one thing I do want to mention is that you cannot dynamically resize the root partitions. ONTAP won't allow it. If you do want to add more drives to your system, reinitialize it. Okay. For specific partition drive sizes and across drive quantities, check out NetApp Hardware Universe, and there's a great section that shows you how to find that. Now, there was a question not too long ago in Discord from fine folks like yourself about, well, what about some caveats? What about some considerations? Here's where we're going to go into that. Resiliency and fault isolation specifically can potentially be difficult because of failure of a physical drive could potentially impact up to 3 aggregates. That's 2 data aggregates and 1 root. So be aware of that. There could also be some workload contention, right, on root aggregates that can and sometimes do impact data aggregate performance. I'm not a performance troubleshooting guy myself, but the NetApp Support Center is very, very good at that should you need performance troubleshooting assistance. And some of you would like to say, well, I paid for these older drives and I want to use them on my newer system. That's fine, but there are some limitations that you need to be aware of. All the partitions on those drives, if they are partitioned, must be removed first, okay? But in order to do that, you got to crush those aggregates. So if you're able to pick your existing data up, put it on a new system, and you want to recycle those shelves, make sure that you offline destroy any aggregates before you attach them to a new system. Otherwise, you get foreign aggregate issues, and nobody wants to deal with that.
Do you run into ownership issues there when you're trying to maybe migrate shelves between systems? Then one has ADP configured, one doesn't. Is there a way to rectify that dynamically, or just without? You just have to tear it all down and.
You must have a crystal ball. I'm going to go over that momentarily. Okay, but ADP also supports Metro Cluster, but that also varies between configurations. ADP is not supported in any form with a FAS Metro Cluster system that is spindle-based, hard drive. Can't do it. Got to be whole drives. We do, however, support it in Metro Cluster IP configurations, and there are some specific hardware bits that are associated with those, though. So for the most complete information, check out Field Portal, look at the Metro Cluster IP technical FAQ. Now, Nick, you preempted this section with your crystal ball question. So let's dive right into that. How can we make it easier if we want to say, I want to retire this old this A200 with its internal drives and plug it into my new A400 because I just want to keep using those drives. Here's how you make it easy on yourself. We introduced some new features in ONTAP 9.2 to the special boot menu that makes it far simpler. So let's dive right in. So if you're familiar with the infamous special boot menu, I spent many a case at this screen. We introduced in ONTAP 9.2 a new option, option 9, configure advanced drive partitioning. Entering a 9 will bring you to this submenu that you see right here. I'm not going to read those to you. You're more than capable of doing that, but we will go over the usefulness of them right now. So option 9A is the most important. This turns all the attached storage into a clean slate by obliterating everything, aggregates, partitions, drive ownership. You do this once per node in the HA pair, but please do it only one node at a time. Yeah. Option B is the second and most common used. This performs a wipe clean of the node and automatically assigns drive ownership and determines the partition layout to use. Remember I said it determines the size of the root partition during initialization. This is the step that actually kicks that process off.
So it's counting the number of drives you have connected, and that's going to determine the partition size of the root partitions across the ADP system.
Absolutely. You got it. Okay. After it reinitializes the drive, it brings you where? To the cluster setup prompt. If you try to run this without running 9A first, and some people do, believe it or not, ONTAP will say, can't do it. You got to run 9A first. So
why is that?
Well, the logic behind that is it wants to ensure that it has a clean slate. Remember, it's doing all this in resident memory. So if you run 9A and all of a sudden the power goes out and you think, oh, well, I'll just bring it back up and run 9B, it doesn't remember that 9A has been run. So you run 9A again and then you run 9B.
Gotcha.
Okay. So just
as a best practice, do you recommend 9Aing both nodes in the pair before 9Bing the first one?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So
it's not a situation where you 9A and 9B one node and then 9A and 9B the other node, because you might have some shared ownership, right?
Exactly. You hit the nail right on the head with a hammer. Do it 9A on node 1, 9A on node 2, 9B on node 1, 9B on node 2.
Got it.
All right. But just as you did with 9A, let the partner complete it first. And you'll know when 9B is done because that node will be sitting at the cluster setup prompt, like I mentioned. 9C is the third option, but it's the least used. Why? It looks like it's about the same. Well, this performs a wipe clean of the node and automatically assigns drive ownership, but it only reinitializes with whole drives, no partitioning. When completing, it comes right back to the cluster setup prompt, just as 9B does. But just as with 9B, if you try to do this without running 9A first, it's not going to do it. It's going to tell you, run 9A first, then come back and talk to me.
What is the difference between this and 9A? Because they feel similar.
Difference between 9C and 9B?
Sorry, the difference between 9A and 9C.
Okay, 9A is the wipe of everything. That's where it's going to clear off your aggregates, your drive ownership, and your partition layout. 9B and 9C are the initializers. B uses partitioning, C uses whole drives. But a logical question is, why would you use this? Well, it really depends on your preference. I find that this is most commonly used in FAS metro cluster deployments. Why? Because FAS metro clusters can't use ADP, so we have to initialize with whole drives. But sometimes it's used in hybrid systems with larger quantities of hard drives. Since the SSDs and hard drives are unpartitioned, then the SSDs are free to be used either with whole drive flash pool or combined into a storage pool, so that way you can share it across aggregates. 9D is less dramatic. Reboot the node. Nothing more really to say there. And 9E kicks you back to the main special boot menu, 1 through 9. Any questions about those two?
No.
I didn't think so.
Those I'm good.
All right, very good. But the newest edition that you may or may not know about because it's so new came about in ONTAP 9.11, boot option 9F, which is remove disk ownership. Now, I might hear you ask, why? Doesn't 9A already do that? Well, yes, it does. But there are some differences. First one is you do not have to run 9A first. We're going to talk about why in just a minute. Stick with me. But just as with 9A, B, and C, one node at a time per node in the HA pair. It removes ownership from all the attached drives and partitions owned by that node, but does not destroy aggregates or unpartitioned drives. Again, I hear you ask, why? I promise I heard you the first time, so here's why. Okay. The use case for this is, say you're upgrading a controller, but you do not want to destroy the aggregates. After you run this command, though, all drives and all partitions will be in an unowned state. You must then manually assign ownership within maintenance mode to all the drives and the partitions for the existing storage to be usable.
Where is the structure of the aggregate kept so that the new controller with a fresh ONTAP install is going to be able to recognize the aggregate abstract, not just because you're assigning disk ownership, right? It's
exactly.
So how does it know? How does that brand new controller with different ONTAP on it know the aggregate of those?
Exactly. And because you can't move shelves in between, this eliminates that whole thing. One has to match a couple details, and I don't have time to go into right now. But say you have your old faithful AFF 8080, and you want to say, okay, support ran out from that in ONTAP 9.8, but you got this nice shiny AFF A400 sitting there. I don't have a way to evacuate all my data, and I don't want to do a backup and restore. I want the easiest route possible. So you run 9F, and then you reassign the drive ownership, use the aggregate layout as it was intact without you having to evacuate everything.
Gotcha. Now,
of course, me being me, I do have some recommendations for you, as you can already see on the screen. Please, please, please collect a copy of disk show -v from maintenance mode from each node before you decide to use this option. Save the output, print it out, give a copy to a friend. I don't care. It doesn't matter to me. Keep a copy for reference. Once the controllers have been replaced, you assign ownership to the whole drive, to the container drives, the drives themselves first. My high school shop teacher, and maybe yours, used to say measure twice, cut once. In this case, I say measure 10 times, cut once. If the partitions aren't assigned correctly, you might end up with a configuration that we in the support center refer to as scrambled eggs, and that can be painful to undo if it's not right.
And what does the output of disk show minus V show you for the unseasoned admins out there? Why is that so important to have?
Well, disk ownership is assigned by what is called the system ID of the controller. And the system ID says, I own this P1, you own this P2, I own this P3, so on and so forth. It's a very long-winded output because it depends on how many drives you have in the system. But it basically says who owns what is the simplest thing.
Gotcha. Okay.
All right. Great questions. Thanks for those. So now, here's what we're all waiting for. Let's talk about partition ownership, starting with the AFF A200. Here we see two AFF A200 systems with RD2 partitioning. I'm not really going to go into the nuances of RD because, as we discussed earlier, both root and data partitions are assigned to the same controller, but ownership of the physical drive uses the same logic. AFF A200 systems follow what is termed the bay ownership of internal drives. As such, as you can see on the screen, every other one, even numbered bays starting with bay 0, go to node A, odd number drive starting with bay 1, go to node B. You'll notice that aside from the drive quantities, the only factor that has changed is the number of spare root partitions, right? Up in the top diagram, there's only 2. In the bottom, there are 4. Why? Got more drives. 36 drive configuration, the layout is still the same, still following the bay ownership policy, only the quantity of drives is different. If this were a FAS system with HDDs present, then only the internal drives would be partitioned. The externals would be left whole. And a 48 drive configuration isn't very different, just has more drives. But remember what I said earlier, only the internal drives will be partitioned if this were a FAS system, and they would leave the external ones whole. But when we introduced ONTAP 9.5, the game changed slightly for the A200. We went to split shelf, which is what we currently use on our mid and high range AFF systems. In a split shelf configuration, bays 0 to 11 go to node A, 12 to 23 go to node B. And you also notice the external shelf also follows along with that example.
Help the people understand why we did that.
So it comes down to an availability standpoint as well as performance. SAS, really, for lack of better terms, is a really lazy protocol. It is of the mindset that I can get to these drives faster through my A path rather than my redundant path. I'm going to always use that A path and potentially bottleneck the performance by doing a split shelf, because the SAS stack comes in through ports on an A module and a B module. We can access it concurrently through the top and the bottom of the stack without potentially degrading any performance for the node.
Cool. So in a way, you're kind of multipathing operations down at the disk level. That's pretty cool.
There's no kind of about it. That's exactly what you're doing. You're also just making sure that all paths are equal, so that way it doesn't favor one link over another. Now, obviously, if a channel fails and you got to replace a cable or a module fritzes out on you, well, then of course you're going to be down to a single channel until you get that hardware replaced. Now, also worth mentioning is that A220 systems, which came with 9.4, always use split shelf. Okay. But there's one detail that I want to advise you and be aware of, especially with this split shelf assignment. As a best practice, populate the shelf from the outside in. Leave the central bays open until you're ready to fill them. This ensures that you got proper drive assignment between the appropriate controllers as ONTAP intends it. New systems with ONTAP 9.7 will automatically have it populated this way for manufacturing, so there's less guesswork, but earlier systems did not. You can still say, well, I have 12 drives and I want to fill 0 to 11 because that's the way that I like it. That's fine. The caveat is if that's your only 12 drives in your system, then drive auto assignment will be disabled, and you'll have to assign drives manually every time you add one. It's kind of a pain. So, as I mentioned, let's shift to the mid-range and high-range systems. Looking at this picture, this is exactly what I'm talking about, populating from the outside in. You'll notice 6 through 17 are empty because I only got 12 drives in the top system, okay? They're always going to use split shelf on the mid and high-range systems, okay? But if you have the maximum of 24 per shelf, well, you're going to look just like the bottom diagram.
Is there any reason logically, go back one real quick, when you've got that empty space, like you said, you're only putting in 12 drives. On node A, you're doing 0 through 5. Why not do 12 through 17, or sorry, 12 through 16 on the node B? Why are you going 18 to 23?
Because
any particular reason?
Well, because 11 and 12, that's the middle of the shelf. You know, we are literally splitting the shelf. Like I said, you can do that.
So in a way, they're mirrored. They're kind of inverse.
Yes.
Used outside in. Okay.
Yes. Metro cluster folks, if you're on the call right now, I'm going to use one of your buzzwords, symmetry. It's symmetrical in its layout. And ONTAP really likes symmetry, especially in Metro cluster deployments. All right. So for those of you who might be ONTAP veterans that remember ONTAP 9.0 and 9.1, there's some legacy behavior that we since did away with if you have more than 24 drives present. Here you can see we have both shelves using split drive assignment, right? Split shelf assignment. But there's a key difference. Look at it. All 3 partitions are assigned to the same node. This was a variance. We did away with this in ONTAP 9.2, so don't panic. You will not see this again. But if you do see this, is it a problem? No. Should you be concerned about it? No. But in this case, the workaround is actually very simple. What you do is you create an aggregate on node A of all the P2 partitions, and then aggregate relocated to the partner. And then you do the same with the P1 partitions on node B, send it back the other way. Then you can offline crush those and do it however you want to. Because aggregate relocation will just reassign the drives for you. That's a simple cheater's way of getting around it. Now, once we get to ONTAP 9.2, all is well again. The external drives mirror the first because we're using split shelf assignment. The catch was, you know, if those are your only 12, you really want them to look like the shelf that's on the bottom. Okay. But if you have 24 and it's already in split shelf, then the next one you will assign and the next one you attach and the next one you attach, they'll all use split shelf. And 48 drives is no different. It's just got more drives. All bays are populated. This is the ideal configuration. You have the largest data partitions, the smallest root partitions. Not always the most financially possible given your budgets, but this is what it would look like in a perfect world with 48 drives.
The small partitions with S in that diagram, is that spare partitions at like sort of spares for the root aggregate, for the root partitions? Okay.
Absolutely correct.
All right. So in the old days, we would do, 2-disk RAID 0 or whatever it was.
RAID 0? Nick, you're scaring me here.
Yeah. So I would have 3 drives. One of them would be a spare. I would do this, maybe RAID 4, the smallest one I could possibly do, and then to make the most use of all of my disks.
Yes.
So that is still keeping spares, quote unquote, for your root aggregate. I just wanted to clarify that.
Yes, absolutely. Great observation. Thank you. Now, I want to throw you a curveball. Okay. This is the A800. So here it is with a 12 drive configuration. Because there are 48 drive bays present, the enclosure is actually broken into 4 quadrants of 12 drive bays each. Each quadrant has its own ASIC, which is why the bay population is done this way. And you'll see as we increase drive quantities how this looks. Jumping to 24, the method is still the same. The population method is still the same on a quadrant base layout, but only the drive quantities are different. Same goes for a 36 and a 48. Now, remember what I said, and on a 48 drive system, this is ideal. everything's full, not always budgetarily possible, but there's one key difference. You'll look at, say, a AFF A400 that has 48 drives. You will notice that they were all split shelf.
Mm-hmm.
The A800, look what happened. The controller is the shelf, so the top row is node A, the bottom row is node B. So it is split shelf, but it's not in a 24 drive shelf configuration.
That was going to be my first obvious question. Like, you just got done telling me on a 2U shelf or one row shelf that I should go outside in. Why are we now doing quadrants?
Well, that's because each of that shelf is broken into 4 12 drive quadrants or 12 bay quadrants, 6 on the top, 6 on the bottom. We move in increments. That's why it just provides the best performance, which if you're buying the A800, you don't want it to run slow. You want it to scream.
You spent a lot of money on that thing.
We did. And a lot of people have too.
Oh, no, I meant them. You spent a lot of money on it. You don't want it to run slow.
Absolutely.
A couple of questions came in if this is a good time.
Sure.
Let's jump in here. Deli jumped in and asked, what is the technical reason that RAID 4 is not possible with partition disks?
It is possible. It's just not enabled by default. If you want to change your aggregate RAID down to RAID 4, go for it. You'll just have less resiliency in case there's a drive failure.
Yeah. You'd be missing out on the double parity disk failure.
You'll be missing out on the double parity, but also remember, you got 3 partitions and you're at RAID 4. You got one failed. Well, now that's the only one you can tolerate. So your second failure, should the worst happen, now you're in a multi-disk panic situation. Yeah. I don't recommend running RAID 4 with partition drives at all.
Yeah. Okay. There you go, Deli. Let's see. Next up, just a kind of a general question about, is there a best practices around spares configs, or are we just saying 2 per aggregate like always?
So with SSDs, you can get away with 1, 1 spare partition per node. You can totally get away with that. Or 1 whole unprovisioned drive per node. I'll go into that in a little bit about that. But the root with 24 or 48 drives, it's going to have 2 spares. And the only reason for that is because that's the maximum it's going to spread out the root aggregate across. So it's just doing that to keep ONTAP from nagging, saying, I don't have any spares.
Is that a tunable, especially for the root aggregate, is that tunable down from 2 to 1, or can you increase it? Or is that just, if you're configuring ADP, it's got the way that it does it, and that's not changeable?
Well, this is the way that it's going to come out of the box to you. Now, there is a NetApp KB article that tells you how you can tune the minimum spares to your liking. Go for it.
Okay. At your own peril.
at your own discretion.
Right. Last one, or well, not the last one, but the next one is, will ONTAP prevent one from assigning 2 partitions to the same node and then add those disks to the same aggregate?
Okay, great question. Get this a lot. Here's what's happening. You can have P1s and P2s assigned to the same node. We saw that in that 9.1 configuration where all 3 of the partitions on the same drive were assigned to the same node. Totally fine. What ONTAP will not allow you to do is put a P1 and a P2 partition, data partitions, not flash pool, that's the exception, a P1 and P2 data partition into the same RAID group. You can have them in, say, the P1 in RAID group 0 and the P2 in RAID group 1, fair game, good to go. You can't put P1 and P2 into the same RAID group 0, say. ONTAP will not allow it, because then if 1 physical drive fails, then you've already lost 2. So you're pretty much running at RAID 4 at that point. It's just too great of a risk, and ONTAP says, not going to do it.
Gotcha. Last one here for now from OG says, is it in any way relevant which node owns the container disk in a V2 config?
Do that again. Is it in
any way relevant which node owns the container disk in an ADP V2 config?
Owns the container disk. Split shelf assignment. Let me jump ahead to this slide here. I know it's kind of difficult to see, but if you notice the outlines here around the drives, you see the blue? That means node A owns the root and owns the whole drive. It also owns this P1 up here. So the split shelf assignment or the bay assignment, whichever it is going to own the container. Remember what I said earlier? The controller that owns the root owns the whole drive.
Okay, so it's not possible to have another node control the drive while another node owns the root partition or root aggregate.
No. What sense would that make? Node A would have its root partition on a drive that node B owns.
Saying it out loud made me just kind of chuckle because that'd be silly.
Exactly. It would be silly. But it's a fair question, though, and I do get that from time to time. Now, enter the AFF A250. It's NVMe. Yay. Everybody loves NVMe drives, right? How does ADP love NVMe drives? The exact same. Look at the top, look at the bottom. You've got 12 drives in the top, 24 drives in the bottom. Same layout, same split shelf as we just showed you with, say, the A220. 36 drives. Looks exactly the same, right? But if you have a fully populated external shelf, then the layout is slightly different on the external shelf. Here we have an A250 with an NS224 shelf hanging out the back of it, fully populated, but you'll notice it's using that quadrant layout. And that's because of the way that the NVMe chassis was developed and deployed for the most ideal and optimal performance. They technically call this
so you've got your embedded drives are in the split shelf config, but you've got your shelf in the quadrants. Because
absolutely.
What's the material difference there?
The material difference is just the internal drives, simplicity. Keep it all the same, but for the NVMe shelves, and there is logic behind this for various other reasons that I don't think we have time to go into right now. They use this interleaved, and that is really to balance the performance of all the drives across the channels, because your NVMe is going to be running over 100 gig rather than a 12 gig SAS link.
Does that have any implications on why we can only put one NS224 shelf off of one of these A250s? Is that still I don't want to call it a limitation, but a configuration limitation? Can we add more than one shelf here, or is that the reason that's limited?
Now, the reason that it's limited is because you cannot, just as you would with SAS shelves, where you can daisy chain, like on a FAS, you can get up to 10 shelves, or an AFF, you can get up to 4 shelves. NVMe tops out its stack at 1. That's it. So even if you have a nice shiny AFF A900, if you want more than 2 shelves, it's going to have to run through a cluster switch, not a cluster switch, but a storage switch.
Gotcha.
But now, flashback to the SAS shelf. If you attach the SAS shelf to the thing, oh, look, it's split shelf again. Why? Because it's not NVMe. Confused yet?
Got it.
All right, very good. Let's move on, because this is now we're going to go into talking about data aggregate creation. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because ONTAP 9.2 did a lot of this for you and eliminate all the guesswork. So as I mentioned, 9.2 has a nice wizard that lets you do all the guesswork and configure your system. If you happen to be running 9.1 and earlier, you won't see this, but you do it the way that you've always done it. But here's an example lab system to illustrate the simplicity. It's an A220, 24 9 or 60 gig drives that has been freshly initialized. Notice that the wizard not only suggests the ideal aggregate layouts, but also the number of drives, partitions of the RAID group, spare data partitions, and usable capacity before you click submit. Awesome, right? You can double check your work before you say, make it so. You may also notice that there's a bottom alert that tells you may still use the aggregate manual creation in case you're not ready to surrender control just yet. It's a toggle switch in the upper right-hand corner of the screen, but I didn't include it in this image because, frankly, I ran out of room on the slide.
Yeah.
But with the aggregate provisioning wizard, new aggregates is the easy part. But the most frequent questions I get are regarding aggregate expansion. I'm sure you have those questions too. So let's chat about those right now. If you're going to expand an existing RAID group, regardless if it's made out of RD or RD2 partitions or whole drives, I want you to add a minimum of 6 partitions or whole drives at a time. Depending on the size of the existing RAID group, may not always be possible if you're close to the maximum. We'll discuss some tricks here at the tail end. But if you're creating a new RAID group, the concept is the same, but the numbers are different. Minimum of 11. Now, I've seen configurations where that new RAID group has about 6. That can get a little iffy, and you might create a hotspot. It can work, and if you do have that configuration, don't worry, because it can still work for you. Just be very careful. Okay.
Of what?
Performance bottlenecks.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, I refuse to keep all of you in suspense any longer. This is what you've been patiently waiting to see while I'm jabbering on and on and on. What I'm about to tell you are some recommended best practices to ensure you have system resiliency and the best possible performance. I'm not going to go through possibilities, and we can burn through much more time discussing every conceivable permutation, as you can imagine. But without further ado, let's start by adding 12 drives to an existing 12 drive configuration. You'll notice I have the shelf illustrated outside in, like I want you to use. Please do that. If you were to have all the drives in 0 through 11, then automatic assignment will be disabled. As soon as you chuck these 12 drives into the system, node A knows that it has 6 through 11, node B knows it has 12 through 17, automatically without interaction. Now, remember what I said earlier. If your RAID group is already composed of partitions, then the whole drives that you add into it will automatically be partitioned when they're added. So in this case, you got to do it in a couple steps. So first, add 6 whole drives to each node's data aggregate.
Ooh.
Thereafter, you can add the remaining, and voila, we have a 24 drive RAID group of already partitioned drives. But notice, once the whole drives become partitioned, you're going to be left with 12 additional root spares. Those cannot be used to create a data aggregate. For whatever reason, if you want to expand the root, go for it. This is the byproduct of expanding post-initialization.
Gotcha. So this was the 9C?
No, that was 9B, but because it only had 12, it only laid out the root across 12 drives, 6 and 6.
Right. Okay. I got you.
Okay. It's already the size that it needs to be. It doesn't need to be any larger, but if you don't like having all those extra spares just hanging about, add them to the root. It won't hurt the system. It'll just
so
reduce
the root is the size of the root partition is determined by the number of drives that are present upon initialization. Is that a good golden rule?
1,000%.
Okay. Good to know.
All right. Now, expanding a 24 drive system is a little easier. When expanding by 12 drives, you can populate one side of the shelf versus the other, just like this. Because the first shelf, and I talked about this earlier, was initialized with an equal distribution of drives in the initial, in the internal system there. And it doesn't matter if this is a low, mid, or high range system, auto assignment remains intact. So in this case, the new drives will automatically go to node A because node A is bays 0 through 11. Now, from here, you can add 12 drives to node A's data aggregate. 12. Yes, 12. This will take the remaining spare partition that you can see at the top of the screen and chuck it into RAID group 0. Now RAID group 0 is filled. RAID group 1 gets created with 11 and retains a whole spare drive. Is this a problem? No. In fact, it's actually quite good, because if a whole drive fails, a whole spare can replace it. If a partition spares, that whole drive will become partitioned to be able to replace what's failed. So it's actually...
Ooh, that's important. Say that one more time for the people in the back.
All right, absolutely. So as we can see, we had one spare data partition in the internal shelf. We added it to RAID group 0. Now that's maxed out. The second RAID group gets created with 11 whole drives, but it leaves the drive in shelf 2, bay 11 as a spare. A whole drive can be used to replace a failed whole drive or a failed partition drive. So you only
get that?
one.
That's pretty sweet.
Isn't that?
Because it wouldn't work the other way around. If your drive was partitioned, it wouldn't be able to be used to come in for a whole disk.
Exactly. Say this parity drive over here failed for whatever reason, and you only have a spare data partition. You don't have a spare. It's going to bark until you have a spare to replace it. But if you retain this, a whole drive here, then you can replace a partitioned or a non-partitioned drive altogether. Pretty sweet, right?
That's slick.
It is. Now, if your preference is to upgrade, say, Node B storage for whatever reason, that's fine. Just put the drives in the other bays and same logic applies.
Well, a little bit ago, I'm gonna check you on something. A little bit ago, you were telling me all of this about symmetry and outside in and split the drives between the two. And why is it different now when we're talking about whole disks? Or is whole disks the pendulum, the lever there, or is it to do with an expansion shelf versus embedded drives?
Your crystal ball serves you well, Nick. Okay, this is what not to do. Okay, maybe you do want to do it, but I don't recommend it. Don't do it. Okay. In this case, you do still have an equal distribution of drives within the external shelf, but this will create that small RAID group on each node, which could result in potential write performance degradation. Plus, it's wasteful in terms of usable storage because now if you go back to the previous diagram, we only had 2 parities, 9 datas and 1 spare. Here you have 4 parities being consumed. So you only really have 3 data drives on each node and you have a spare on each side. Don't do it. It's not very efficient.
That's not good.
No.
Got it. Okay.
But what happens when you want to put a whole new shelf in, brand new shelf that you want to have in? Well, frankly, that eliminates a lot of headaches. So fill all the bays. And just as we talked about before, because auto assignment was intact when the system was initialized, the bottom shelf, look, it did all that work for you.
So it's automatically, as soon as you plug it in, plug it in hot. It's gonna pull those drives in as spares, auto assign to each node respectively, and then you can go in and extend the aggregate to another RAID group.
1000%, absolutely. So now here,
I love ONTAP.
I do too, right? Isn't it great?
Yeah.
So here, all we need to do is add 12 drives to each data aggregate and watch what happens here. Isn't that nice? The final configuration means that you got 11 drives in the bottom shelf per RAID group, 24 partitions in the top RAID group, and you got 1 whole spare per node. It's a great place to be.
Yeah.
Now, on to the fun stuff. This is the AFF A800. Remember I told you about that quadrant thing that we got going on here. Say you bought a nice shiny AFF A800 and you only got 24 drives and you decide to expand with a pack of 6. Well, in this case, because of the quadrants, you got to be careful where you plug it in. You'll notice those little plus signs I put on there make it more easily to distinguish. So first, you want to populate drives 3, 9, 15, 27, 33, and 39. Hike. Okay. Now, the next step needs to be multi-step. Okay. First, you're going to expand node A's data aggregate by 3, and this is going to automatically add 1 spare and 2 whole drives into the data aggregate. Because we use whole drives to expand it, they're going to be sliced and diced for you. Then you can do the same thing on node B, expanding by 5 because some of those drives are still whole and some have already been partitioned. That's why the numbers are kind of odd. But once that's done, you can add the remaining 3 data partitions back into node A. Here's what this is going to look like. Okay, so in this case, we increase the RAID group size to 28, which is the maximum that RAID DP can handle. So now we just have one singular RAID group per data aggregate.
I like that. Simplicity.
Simplicity. Yes, absolutely. Now, here's some trickery that you're going to learn. Pay attention to this one, okay? Say you have that same A800, but you're going to add 12 instead of 6. Well, the method becomes a little bit different. First, I want you to decrease the maximum RAID group size to 23. Hear me out, okay? Default is 24. I want you to take it down to 23. Then in the top row, populate 3, 4, 9, 15, 16, and 21. And on the bottom row, populate 27, 28, 33, 39, 40, and 45. It should look something like this.
Still with you.
Now, just as we did, multi-steps. First, node A, we're going to expand by 6. This will automatically add 1 spare and 5 whole drives into the data aggregate. This will create a new RAID group with 11 partitions. Wait, partitions. Yes, you heard me right. This is the true trick to ADP. Because we're including a data partition along with the whole drives will become partitioned because it says, hey, we need to match this partition. It's already here. So many of you may want to continue using ADP on new RAID groups, but aren't quite certain how to do it. This is how. If we added 12 whole drives, well, then you got 12 whole drives in your new RAID group, just like we saw a couple slides ago. But also worth mentioning, though, the GUI won't help you here because you're specifying non-default behavior saying, give me this partition and these whole drives. You got to do it all by the command line. System Manager just won't allow that to happen. Now, after that's done, you could expand node B's data aggregate by 11, and this will grab 5 data partitions from node A and 6 whole drives, and this creates 11 new partitions for node B. Once that's done, add those in, and your final configuration looks something like this. So think about that. If you're expanding into new RAID groups with exclusively whole drives, they're going to remain whole, unpartitioned. But if you include a spare data partition in with those whole drives, then everything's going to be partitioned.
Random question. Why so many spare partitions on the root partitions? Go back one to that. Yeah. Why so many spare partitions in the root aggregate?
Because remember, these are all newly added drives.
Yeah.
And the root's already as large as it needs to be.
Oh, okay.
So when you add more drives, it's going to produce more spare root partitions.
Sure. Okay. So just as a default of partitioning a whole disk, you're going to have a root spare, a data spare for node A and a data spare for node B, right?
And a root spare. Now, if you have all these drives in the system at the time of initialization, you're only going to have 2 spare root partitions per node, and the root's going to be spread across all your entire quantity up to 48 drives.
Got it.
Well, that was pretty cool,
we have
right?
A lot of them.
Yes, I'm sure that I do. And I'll be on Discord here later today.
Hang on, we're going to go over a few of them right here.
All right, let's
quick.
Go for it.
Let me pull that off, and let's see. Where did I So I think this was where we left off. How do you get those drives partitioned in the second shelf?
We just talked about that.
Yeah, we did. Okay. So we'll kick that one. Thank you, Saban. He mentioned a concern you're still losing 2 full drives to sparing. Is there a way around that where you can just keep a whole 1 drive per shelf or per system? Is there a way to keep 2 drives per system as long as they're the same as the disks that are throughout your system, or is it a per aggregate sparing?
You can keep them same. If you're fortunate enough to have bought your entire quantity of the same drive size, and I don't care if this is SSDs or spindles, as long as the drive sizes are the same, you just keep a spare. But if they don't have, if they're different, like say you have internally, you have 960 gig SSDs and externally you have 3.8s or 7.6s or even larger than that, then you're going to want to be careful about maintaining your spares, because if you exhaust all of your 960 gig drive partitions or whole drives, as spares for one reason or another, failures, or you just add them in for whatever reason, and you only have a spare 7.6, well, guess what? If a partition drive fails with that 960 and you got a spare 7.6, it's going to grab it.
Okay. Regardless of what aggregate the spare is assigned to?
On that node.
On that node. Okay.
Yep.
So ideally, in the situation where you have as many shelves as you can have, and they all have the exact same disks in sizes and capacities in them. I mean, per node, 2 spares.
You can get away with. I mean, the root from 12 to 24 drives will always give itself 2 spares. It always will, and that's okay. It's not hurting you in that configuration,
especially if it's partitioned.
Exactly. But when you're talking about data partitions, you can keep 1. 1 is fine. 2, if you want to be overzealous and you're like, I really like the insurance of having 2, keep 2. That's fine.
We always had spares, but I didn't always keep them in the systems.
Some folks like to exhaust all their spares and just let it run at utmost capacity. You can do that, but ONTAP is going to nag you and say, I don't have any spares.
No, I would keep 1, but I wouldn't keep that. But we had pretty universal. This is days when the drives were still vertical and they were called fiber channel disks.
Oh, yeah.
A long time ago. But I would have a stack of the different spares of the different drive sizes that we have just sitting in my cubicle waiting for one to fail.
Absolutely.
Yep.
14 drive shelves. I remember them well.
The DS14s.
Yeah, man.
Okay. James threw one in here. Not really a question, but we have some A400s with 3 shelves, 72 drives, and they were all partitioned. Not sure how they got that way or why. Is there a default configuration that's shipped with a new system? Or is this like, would somebody have come in and potentially configured this for James?
That sounds like a post-deployment configuration. Manufacturing, if you order it from manufacturing, they will only do up to 48. Now, I'm not saying that that's a hard, fast rule. Exceptions can happen, as often as the wind blows. But it sounds like this is a post configuration. So in your case, I would look for extra spare root partitions hanging out in your system. If you see 12 or so of them per node, well, that's probably what happened.
Gotcha. Cool, James. I hope that answers your question, man. Let's see. So Corey asked, so ONTAP or Waffle makes you have hot spares. Is there anything preventing you from shooting yourself in the foot?
If you want to exhaust all your spares?
No, if you just don't want to have any spares.
Yeah, if you want to just say, well, forget it. I'm going to use all of my spare data partitions in my data aggregate. I'm just going to run with the most capacity I can. Yeah, you could do that. Heck, matter of fact, that's the default behavior on the C190. But otherwise, on other AFF systems or FAS systems, ONTAP's going to nag you saying spares low, and it's going to nag you every hour until you put another spare into it. Now, like I said earlier, there is a NetApp KB article that allows you to muck about with the amount of spares in the system. Some people who have bought a C190 don't like that behavior. They say, I like to have a spare in my system. More power to you. Go ahead. Here's how you modify that. And that is available in NetApp KB.
There were certain systems, as far back as the mid to late 2000s, that where they were secondary systems, Snap Vault secondary or something like that. It would be sitting off site waiting for a vault to come in on a daily basis. And I wouldn't have any spares on it. I would have spare drives sitting in a storage cabinet.
Yep.
Or on a shelf or something like that. But yeah, I wouldn't configure those with spares. Mission critical systems that are running Oracle, damn right, they're getting 2 spares.
They're getting spares, absolutely, and
but
especially
it's really it's there's not a one size fits all for any of this stuff. It's really subjective based on the workload and the criticality of it. You're going to have 2 parity partitions or drives anyway.
Yep.
So yes, you can tolerate a double disk failure there based on that. However,
yep.
It's not ideal. Don't do that to yourself.
Exactly. And to build on what you're saying, it also depends on your degree of paranoia. Especially if you have large capacity hard drives, like 16 terabytes plus, some customers keep more than 2 spares in their system at any one time, just because they are so huge and the rebuild time takes as long as it does. They're like, I want to make sure I got enough insurance here. That's all.
There's a certain, I'll leave them unnamed, consumer storage system that I have several of. And I finally got around to upgrading some of the drives from 10 terabyte to 14s. I had a mixed disk shelf, basically, of 14s and 10s. Well, I got the 3 10s out and put 14s in. Now I have all 14 terabytes. 3 days. And it's still doing its initial data scrub. Like after you finish doing the repair and the rebuild, we're on day 4. Actually, no, Friday. I started it on Friday.
Goodness.
We're on day 6. So
somebody needs to sell you an ONTAP array.
Right. I know, right? Boy, I should really get that thing up and running. The future thing like that. Scott, I'd love to have you back sometime. I thought it might be a fun idea as well. Maybe we do it here, maybe we do it on the Data Center Dude channel, but maybe we do like a walkthrough video, because I'm basically sitting at 9.8 RC1. I need to upgrade ONTAP, and as part of that, we need to configure ADP on that system, and I think it might be fun to try and do that live. And then I can, we can have a little workshop or something like that. But I'll reach out to you. Let me know, guys. Let me know in Discord if that's something that you'd be interested in watching live.
I'm game.
We're getting ready to start cranking through some videos on that FAS 500F. A couple last little questions here. Let's see. Saban asked, for the A200, when you're expanding storage to a second shelf, how can you partition it?
Okay, same way that you could do anything else. As I mentioned, that if you attach a second shelf and you have a spare data partition, you could say, I want to create a new RAID group with this data partition and my whole drives. It's going to slice and dice those drives. Now, the cool thing is in ONTAP 9.6, ONTAP 9.6, we put a cool little command into it to reduce a little bit of headaches for you. The caveat is the SSDs must be the same size to do this. So if you got 960s and 3.8s, this isn't for you. If you have 960s and 960s, everything's matchy, then you can do this. The command is storage disk create partition. And what that will do, it will allow you to say, hey, I'm going to use this drive as a template, my source drive, and my target drive is going to be partitioned after I run this command. So you can do this manually through the command line. A lot of details are found out on the field portal. Check out the ADP SE presentation, which has a lot of illustrations that I already used in today's broadcast, but also the ADP technical FAQ. And that technical FAQ has a lot more verbiage and a lot more to digest than what I covered today. So please hit the field portal, download those 2 things. If you have any questions, as Nick said, I hang out on Discord a lot, and he knows how to get a hold of me in case I'm not. So if you got any other questions, comments, or snide remarks, I'm open to hearing them now.
We got plenty of the snide remarks. OG, to close us out here, wants to ask one final one. When are you coming back to present ADP v3?
ADP v3. Do you know something I don't?
I don't know. OG does, apparently. I don't know anything about that. Well, Scott, thank you very much
as technology evolves, I'll be a part of it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Scott. I feel like we could do this for another whole hour, but you are a busy man. We don't have time to do that. And everybody's got to go back to work, I think. So
Yeah,
thank you for joining us here at NetApp On Air. Thank you for hanging out in Discord. Thank you for always being a part of these crazy ideas that I have to do these shows and these videos and stuff like that. I'll circle back with you at some point about getting the old Fast 500F running, and maybe we do that live. Maybe we make a video out of it. We'll
Game
see.
on.
We'll see. All right, Scott. Thank you very much, sir. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Nick. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
All right, guys. Well, that's going to do it for us today. Be sure and jump into Discord if you haven't already. I'll drop a link for us right here. You can go in. You can talk to Scott. You can talk to some of we have VPs in there. We have subject matter experts and our deep engineers all listening and waiting for your feedback and your questions and all kinds of good stuff. You can find links to it at netappdiscord.com.